Okay. And then let's see, I'm going to start the slides here. Probably should have done that before I started recording. Okay. I'm glad you guys could join us tonight. We're studying John's Gospel. Do you see that slide, John's Gospel? David, do you see it?
Is it yes, sir.
Okay, good. So chapter 4 for tonight. And by the way, let me just tell you that we're going to be traveling next Monday. So no study next Monday, but the 5th chapter for 2 weeks from tonight will be the 14th of October. This is a map of the early days in early travels in Jesus' ministry. It shows a number of the places, but it's, if you look way down in the corner, on the lower left, it says Samaria. And we're going to pass through Samaria. He's going to pass through Samaria in John chapter 4. So it actually is going to be taking place off of this slide, but just know that when you're going from Jerusalem to Galilee, you've got to go through or around Samaria. And they were going through it in John chapter 4. Just to review, here is a macro outline of the book. And so we've got the prologue, nice prologue, different than the other gospel accounts. And then we get right into the bulk of Jesus' ministry, the rest of chapter 1 through chapter 10, where Jesus is disclosing who he is by his words and his deeds. Then we kind of get this transition period in chapters 11 and 12, examples of bringing someone who died back to life and talking about death. And then chapters 13 through 20, Jesus' self-disclosure in the cross and his exaltation. And then an afterthought, seemingly an epilogue, chapter 21, very unusual closing to John's gospel. The characteristics of John's gospel, we've gone over this again, but just real quick. He omits a lot of the things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about, but he includes much that Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not talk about. And we're seeing that when he does include something, we're getting a very involved encounter. We saw Jesus with Nicodemus, and we got a lot of verses about Nicodemus in chapter 3. And then we've got the Samaritan woman, a lot about her tonight in chapter 4. So his style is much different than the synoptics. And so his gospel is really independent of the synoptics. We think he wrote it later, and it speaks to Jesus about Jesus in a different way. I think the passage that really stands for the whole gospel, John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So, just to review what we just covered in chapter 3 last time, Nicodemus visited Jesus by night. And then we have that wonderful section where he explains God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Beautiful prose and beautiful explanation of why Jesus came. And then we've got John the Baptist disclosing or confirming who Jesus is and why Jesus' ministry had to take the forefront, and John's would fade into the background. And an interesting verse in that section, verse 34, for he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. And a very distinguishing feature of Jesus, he has access to the Spirit without limit. Some of the commentators say that the prophets that came before had enough of the Spirit guiding them to get them through whatever it was they were going to do. They had a measure of the Spirit, but Jesus had the Spirit and gave it without measure. All right. So when we come to chapter 4, the bulk of chapter 4 is Jesus dealing with the Samaritan woman at the well. And it's an interesting conception. Of course, we don't know what Jesus looked like, but this is a beautiful picture of Jesus and that Samaritan woman at the well. What might have happened there? We learn an awful lot about Jesus in this encounter, and I'm sure that's why John recorded it in so much detail. But let's start by reading verses 1 through 6. And I'll read them to get us started, but you guys keep in mind, see if you can listen and hear what this section tells us about Jesus' humanity. You know, he is God, but he is man. And we get something about his humanity here. So this is John 4, 1 through 6. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. Do you see what we learn about Jesus' humanity there? It says he was wearied from his journey. It doesn't seem like he had unlimited power all the time. It seems like he really was human like we are, and this trip kind of wore him out. He was tired. And we're going to learn later that he was hungry too. So the things that we have challenges with, the needs that we have, he had as well. Bill? Remember, you're muted. Can you get it? Okay, you got it.
Did Jesus ever baptize anybody?
No, he did not. They did it at his direction. It says that, Jesus was baptizing in, I think it was chapter 3, but this correction tells us that he didn't actually do it. It was done by his direction. And you know why? I think we know why. Because when we look at the Corinthian letter, Paul said he was glad he didn't baptize anybody because he thought that would lead to a kind of a party spirit. And they'd be arguing about, I was baptized by Paul, I was baptized by Apollo, and they were, I think if Jesus baptized anybody, they would have thought, we are it. We are the guy now. Jesus baptized me. So I'm pretty sure that's why he just had the guys do it and he didn't.
Interesting.
Yeah, so important information about baptism being done at his direction, but not by him directly. A lot of history with Jacob's well. You can read about that in the book of Genesis. And so there are certain places that come around different times in the Bible. Multiple things happen there. And so this is a famous well. And, there've been interesting things happening there for centuries at this point. But here's another one in John chapter 4. So it's about the 6th hour, and we think that's about noon. So there's what's going on at that point. Who read for us verses 7 through 10?
I'll give it a shot, Jay.
Okay, Bill?
When the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water."
Okay. So an encounter, a chance encounter, seemingly. She was there to the well for a purpose, a very physical, mundane purpose, get water. And so, not anything too mysterious about that. But Jesus just happens to be there, and the disciples happen to have gone on. So, it's just the two. And so, you can see from the way she explains it that Jesus is stepping out of convention here by addressing this woman. Typically, it says in verse 9, Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. There's a long history there. You can go back to 2 Kings chapter 17 and see how the Samaritans came into being. And you can see how the rivalry came up between the Jews and the Samaritans. But it had been going on a long time at this point, and they just did not get along. Doesn't seem like Jesus was impressed by that at all. He did not see any wall between him and the woman, and it surprised the woman. She's, how is it that you clearly they could tell one was a Jew and wasn't? They could tell who was who. Why would you even talk to me? Why would you ask me for something to drink? Typically, that wouldn't happen. So instead of explaining, well, I'm Jesus, I'm the Savior, I'm not prejudiced in any way, I'll speak to anybody. Instead of explaining it like that, he takes it right away to another level. And in my way of thinking, this comment that he makes goes right over her head. What in the world did he just say? He said, if you knew the gift of God and who it was who was talking to you, you would have asked him for a drink, and he would have given you living water. What in the world is he talking about? I mean, this to me is a kind of a curiosity approach. It's not really answering any question. It's giving rise to like 5 or 6 more questions. And he's just going to see, is she interested in talking further? So, there's a spiritual level to what he was talking about. But again, I don't think she caught that at all. She's just kind of in the physical mindset. There's physical water here that we're talking about, and you clearly don't have the means to get any of the physical water. So what's going on? So we'll see how that unfolds in verses 11 through 15. Would one of you like to read 11 through 15 for us?
I can read it, Jeff.
Remember, you got it, David?
Sure.
Okay.
Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds? Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. He told her,
Okay.
Go. Oh,
That's
that
good.
in?
Yeah, that's good. Verse 15. So he had said he'd give her living water, and she just says, look, you don't have anything to draw with. Probably needed a pot on the end of or a pail, on the end of a rope. and you've got to lower that down. You've got to bring the water up. Clearly, he didn't have any device like that. So she points it out to him in verse 11 and asks, where are you going to get the water? And then she asks a follow-up question in verse 12. Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well, and he drank from it, as did his son and his livestock. So again, that's back to the history of this well. It really is famous, and it's been functioning for over 1,000 years at this point, it seems like. But in answer to that question, are you greater than Jacob? The simple answer would have been yes, I am. I'm a lot greater than Jacob, actually. But he doesn't go there either. He just goes on another one of these comments that raises more questions than answers. Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I give him will never be thirsty again. And the water that I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. What in the world? I mean, how could she even begin to understand what he's talking about? But, she's still thinking about the physical water. And the idea of not having to come back here every day to draw water seems pretty attractive. So she says, yeah, give me some of this water so I don't have to come back here every day. And you could just see there's a limited but progressive understanding. She's getting a little of this, but not a lot. Bill, go ahead.
Um, Working in Haiti, we see women drawing water every day, and some
Yeah,
of them will have to travel a mile or more to get a 5-gallon bucket of water, and they
yeah,
will take a handkerchief and wrap that around the top of their head and put that 5-gallon bucket on their head and then walk back that however far it is. Some are luckier
yeah,
than others,
yeah.
but you see what a chore that is, and you also see what a luxury it is that we have, that all we have to do is walk in the other room, turn the spigot on.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And so you also think that that's a lightweight plastic bucket that she used, but the lady at the well, the Samaritan woman, she was using a clay pot, which is probably almost as heavy as the water, maybe heavier. So
It's true.
uh, you can really appreciate her
Yeah,
her understanding and saying, "Hey, I don't want to be thirsty anymore."
it's right. Yeah. She just said, I'll be glad to get some of that living water. I don't have to come back here every day. So we don't know how much she's getting of what he's saying, but she's still there and they're still talking. So that's good. And she said she's ready to have the living water. So that's a good step. Even if she doesn't understand all that's involved, she just says, I'm ready. I'd like to have some. So notice where Jesus goes next. Um, who read for us verses 16 through 18? Dan, you want to unmute? Yeah,
It
there you
helps,
go.
doesn't it?
It helps a lot.
Yeah. So he told her, go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. Time to turn the page.
Okay.
The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true.
Okay, so that's good. That's just those 3 verses, 16, 17, 18. Jesus kind of disengages from the path that they were on, talking about this living water, and he says, now go get your husband. So why in the world would he do this? Before we answer that, look at her response. She says, I have no husband. And he says, you're right, you have no husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the one that you now have is not your husband. What you've said is true. it seems to me, dear ones, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that there was some issue in her life that needed to be dealt with. And it was an issue about marriage. And so before going any further, he just brings this up. You need to go get the one that you call your husband, and we need to talk about some things. Um, I I'm just guessing that's where he was going, that there was an issue that needed to be dealt with, and they were going to do that before he went any further. Of course, she doesn't comply and go get her husband. She just uh, sees that he's a prophet. How in the world could he have known that about her unless he was a prophet? So then she pulls out a prophet question that she's been keeping for a while. So let me read verses 19 through 24. Verse 19, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is a place where people ought to worship. And so that seems to be her prophet question. Okay, which mountain is the right mountain to worship on? And Jesus is going to answer that. In verse 21, Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. So here's Jesus. She asked this really specific question. Are we supposed to worship on Mount Gerizim in Samaria? Or are we supposed to worship in Jerusalem, which was on a mountain? And, which is the right one? And you know what? Jesus didn't really even answer that question directly. He said a number of things that are true, and he goes on to share some deep truths that, you'd think that he'd save revelation like this for some of his best students, but he shares it with a Samaritan woman. It's really amazing to me. He says, the hour is coming. There's going to be a time when you're not going to worship on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, or in Jerusalem. Neither one. And dear ones, I just wish people understood that, even today, that we don't have to have Jerusalem to worship God anymore. There's an awful lot of fighting that goes on to keep possession of Jerusalem, and I think some folks think that it's just crucial to their worshiping of God. And Jesus said that's going to be the day that you don't need either mountain to worship him. You worship him wherever. And he also took, go ahead, Bill.
Well, my translation for verse 22, he starts out the sentence by saying, You Samaritans worship with what you do not know, and we worship what we know. But he sounds like he's rebuking the Samaritans there.
Yes.
As well as anybody else who worships what they don't know. But
he does. Yeah. And it's a real interesting study, as I mentioned, back in 2 Kings 17. You can check it out there. But what it tells you in 2 Kings 17 is when the Assyrians conquered Israel, whose capital was Samaria, they took members of the Israelites off to Babylon, and they brought people from Babylon or other nations that they had conquered back to Jerusalem or back to Samaria. So they shuffled the populations. And what happened was the folks that came from other places, brought idols with them that they worship. And everybody just started worshiping everything. And it was a mess. And they continued doing that. They just continued worship. They'd worship God some, but they'd worship other things too. And remember, God is a jealous God, and He doesn't want us worshiping anything else. So they've got a hodgepodge of, little of this, little of that kind of religion in the Samaria. And Jesus said, "You guys worship, you don't know what." It's just, he didn't have a lot of respect for what they did. There's some worship that can be wrong. You just come right out and say it. And the Samaritans were off base. And he said salvation is from the Jews. But then a great truth in verse 24. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And how critical to have both of those things. Some folks have the truth and are just empty. God's chosen frozen. You're not even there. You kind of come in the door, you sit in the back, you head out afterwards, and you didn't really even do anything. There are other folks that have a lot of spirit, but they don't have the truth. They're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or leaving something undone that they should be doing. And so this great commandment, truth, God is a spirit, and you've got to worship him with both of those things, spirit and truth. Well, she's got another prophet question that she wants to ask. And so who'll read for us verses 25 through 30?
I'll take another shot at it, Jeff.
You go.
This is verse 25. The woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you are he." Just then the disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking to her?" Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" And they came out of the town and made their way toward him.
Just love this section. This is great. So, she had her first big prophet question that she was saving. This mountain or in Jerusalem, is which place are we supposed to worship? Well, now she says, I know the Messiah is coming, but she's been taught that the Messiah was going to come and he was going to teach him all things. So it really isn't a question for him, but she shares that understanding, and Jesus tells her in a kind of a third person way, I who speak to you am he. I am the Messiah. And he makes that confession directly to her. And it must have got through to her. There's some other things here that Jesus said that she didn't understand, but she got this one. And she got it so hard that she forgot her water pot. The reason she came that day was to get the pot filled up, and she left it. She left it and went home without it. And you'd think a person that only knew that much about Jesus wouldn't be a very effective evangelist, but she just about converts the whole town. When she goes back and she says, "This fellow told me everything I ever did." And I just wonder, she asks the question here, could this be the Messiah? She didn't even confess he was the Messiah. She just asked the question, do you think this might be the Messiah? And you know what they did? They went out to check. They went out to check. They went out of the town in verse 30 and were coming to him. Any comments or question through verse 30?
I wonder if someone came to my town, would I follow? Would I go back out and or with all the truth or truth and lies seem to be so easy to mix up nowadays that
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to. And if that person doesn't have status in the community, of course I realize that those small villages are much tighter knit than our communities are now, or so it seems anyway. um that I kind of wonder what would happen in today's world. And I also
yeah.
always often wonder it, how would we treat Jesus now? Would we do the same thing to him would we put him up on the cross now like they did then?
Yeah, yeah. The way I look at it, the day that we say, "Oh, we wouldn't put Jesus on the cross," is a day we probably need to look at ourselves a little more honestly in the mirror, because I bet we would have. So,
I have a
why don't
question
we?
for you, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
In that where the apostles, disciples ask or act as if they were surprised that he was speaking to a woman, I've always been puzzled. Is it because she was a Samaritan woman, or was it just that that wasn't something that was appropriate in that day for a man to be speaking to a woman out there that he didn't know?
I think it was unusual. It was unusual for a man to be speaking to a woman that he didn't know. Um, and the Samaritan part of it is certainly in play here, but it doesn't say that the disciples were put off that it was a Samaritan woman, really,
No.
just that he was speaking to a woman. They were surprised.
Yes.
And again, I think it shows that Jesus didn't accept a lot of the social stereotypes that or prejudices that were in play. And, she's there, he's going to talk to her. So um, I think there's a lesson in here for us to connect with people and to find opportunities to share with them, no matter what the social mores are. I mean, where oh, I shouldn't talk to that person. I'm not going to talk to that person. And Jesus seemed like talk to people and talk to whomever.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So here comes the reaction. And we saw before that Jesus was thirsty and he was hungry, but now we're going to see that there's a little alternate nourishment that he has access to that they didn't really understand either. Now it's the disciples' turn to not really understand. In verse 31, meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do not say, 'There are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest.' Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for life eternal, so that sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true: one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." So the disciples are a little slow on the uptake here. Um, Rabbi, eat something. He says, "I have food you don't know about." And they're like, "Would somebody give him a sandwich? How do you get, what is he, somebody slip him something?" He says, "No, no, no, no. My nourishment is to do the will of my Father." And so, in a sense, I've been nourished just by talking to this woman. And you can look at the calendar, you can look at the seasons, and the harvest time is coming, and it's not quite yet. But he says, "Look into the field; they're white with harvest." And I imagine what he was saying was, if you look towards that town of Sychar that they were talking about, where the woman had just run back to and made her raised her question and they were coming out, the way that a crowd comes out over a field, probably in, attire that's lighter colored, he says, look, here comes the harvest. We're having a harvest here in Samaria of all places. And, it's not what you would expect, and that's the way the gospel can work. That's the way the truth about Jesus can work. You can have a harvest just any time. It's when somebody connects with what you're talking about. And so, there's a great quote that goes back to Isaac Newton. Someone told him, uh, he was a genius. And I think he said, if I've seen further than other people, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. And there's a connectedness with what these apostles were doing and what the prophets that had come before had done. And so he says, there's been a lot of sowing here, and you're reaping what other people sowed. Just kind of puts in perspective about where this harvest is coming from. Well, let me read.
Jeff, one more thing before you go on.
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
think that in my mind, what he's referring to in this quote also is that there's not a special time to
That's right.
evangelize. That you can
That's right.
evangelize anytime, winter, summer, spring, or fall. I mean,
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
right. Now's the time.
Yeah. Be instant in season and out of season, the Apostle Paul said. And it's always the time. It's always the
Right.
time. Now, here's what's interesting. That woman, remember, went back to her town and she just asked the question, could this be the Christ? And they came out. Listen to what happened as it goes on. In verse 39, many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. So that question that she asked, just beautiful question, could this be the Christ? They went to see for themselves, and they were convinced. There's an old story. I collect a lot of old preacher stories, things that never happened, but use them from time to time. Hope they're helpful. But the two guys standing outside a zoo tiger exhibit. They're at the zoo, and they're looking at the tiger. And the one fellow says to the other, you know what? I don't think that's real. He goes, what do you mean? And I don't think that's a real tiger. And the fellow starts to explain how it is a real tiger. You could tell. And he keeps going on and on. And the other fellow says, no, I just don't think it's a real tiger. He says, well, you know what? I think you ought to just go in there and let the tiger prove himself to you. I think it's kind of that way with Jesus. People who start are trying to defend him. Yes, Jesus is the Savior. Why don't you just get into the Word and see if it doesn't convince you? That's what happened to these folks that came out of the town of Sychar. They got next to the Word, Jesus, and listened to his words, and they were convinced. And I think that'll happen when people are honest. And like you said, Bill, it can happen anytime.
We took my granddaughters. I have a friend that was the animal trainer at the National Zoo. And it
Okay.
just so happens that he was the tiger keeper.
Oh, how about it?
And so we got to go inside where the back workings, the inner workings, or the jowls, if you want to say, of the tiger exhibit.
Yeah.
And so they were outside, and it was time to be fed. So they came to the back door, and we were standing at the door on the other side of the door, which was a 2-inch thick steel door, and a double glass, big wide screen inside of it, metal screen. And those tigers jumped up on that door, and my granddaughters and we were there, and roared because it was dinner time. And my granddaughters took off back down. They pop up. It's time to go home.
Man, oh man, I guess so. The
About
power
9
of
feet
those
tall when
animals.
they're stretched out like that. They're amazing creatures, just amazing.
Wow, that's kind of neat. And I'm always better to have a real story than a made up preacher story. So I appreciate you
But those
sharing
tigers were real. They didn't need any convincing of that. That's for
that.
sure.
They convinced you, right? Yeah. Well, verses 43 through 45, after the 2 days, he departed for Galilee. For Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done at Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. So, yeah. So good reception in Samaria unexpectedly, and now a good reception in Galilee. Well, one more thing to go here, and let me just go ahead and read this last part. This is a pretty long chapter. I'm going to do verses 46 through 54. And this is kind of a jump shift. We're moving on now from the Samaritan. We moved on from Samaria, and we're in Cana of Galilee. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water into wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. The official said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus said to him, Go, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, Your son will live. And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. So he heals this official's son, and this shows Jesus' dominion over disease and over distance. Did you see? He didn't have to be right next to the person to heal them. He accomplished this healing from who knows how far away. And so that's interesting. And he's got the ability, he could change water into wine, the first miracle that he did. And then this one, he heals someone who's at the point of death. At least that's what his father said. He's at the point of death. And he does it long distance. And he does it instantaneously as well. It just happened immediately.
And with no fanfare.
Yeah, again,
Not a
both
lot of
of these.
people knew about that.
No, this wasn't about making a big splash, getting a big crowd together, just helping people.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that shows another thing about the kinds of things that we can do and how we should do them. Just help people.
Yeah.
Okay, dear ones. Well, that's a long chapter. I appreciate you sticking around for the whole thing. Remember, we'll be gone on the 7th, a week from tonight. So no study then. But we'll pick that up again with chapter 5, 2 weeks from tonight on the 14th.
Okay, and
Well-
I'll talk to you Friday.
Sounds good, Joe. We'll talk
Sure.
Friday.
Okay,
Have a
thanks
safe
much.
trip.
Yep, enjoy.
Okay, thanks so much. We're headed
You
to
too,
Alabama
Gene.
to see my oldest. Okay.